So let's start creating some reusable components we can use inside our application for our input fields. And what we'll do, we'll go into our Explorer window. And inside the app folder, I'm just going to create another new folder and call it common. And inside the common folder, I'm just going to create another new folder and call it form. And we'll create a new file inside here called textinput.tsx. And just like any other component, it's going to start its life with a snippet. And we're going to use the RAFC to create this. So what we're going to do is we're going to give some strong typing to our form inputs here. And React Final Form and Semantic UI React both provide types that we can use inside here. So we'll create a new interface and call it iProps and say that this extends the field render props, and we get these from React Final Form. And the field render props takes two type parameters. It takes the type of the field value, so in the case of an input this is going to be a string, and it also takes the type of the element as well, which is going to be a HTML element. So what we need to do is pass in a string as the first type parameter here, and then HTML input element in this case. And we also need to pass some form field props from Semantic UI React. So we'll bring in form field props as well, and we'll get those from Semantic UI React. And we don't need to pass any of our own properties in here, so just extending the types that are provided is enough in this particular case. And then what we'll do is we'll give our text input a type of React FC, and we'll pass in our iProps inside here. So then we'll destructure the props that we're going to get when we use our final form field. And what we're going to bring in is the input props itself. We'll also bring in the width, which is available on our form field props. We'll also add the type, and for a text input sometimes we might want to pass the type, especially if it's a password field for instance. So we'll also bring in the type here as well. We'll bring in a placeholder, and then we'll want to use the meta properties that we get from React Final Form. And if we just go and take a look at the GitHub page for React Final Form, and we just take a look down in the documentation here and take a look at the API, and we take a look inside the field render props, then what we get here is some meta properties that we can use to check to see if there's an error, and these are used in the case of validation, and we can also check to see if the field has actually been touched. And what we're going to do is we're going to set up our components for validation, but we're not going to add validation right now. It just means that when we do add validation, our input fields are going to have the ability to display the validation errors on our components. So what we'll also bring in here is the meta, and what we'll bring in is touched, and we'll bring in the error as well. And I'll just reformat this. So what we want to do inside our return here is we want to add a Semantic UI form field. So I'll just add form and specify field. And our form field can display some styling if there's an error. It's going to color the field in a sort of pinkish color and give it a red border. And we need to tell it if it has an error to go ahead and do this. So we'll pass in the error here. And first of all, we'll check to see if the field has been touched and that it has an error. And what we can do is our error is of type of any, but it's going to be an error object. And what we want to do is just return a Boolean if we have an error. And we can do that by using a double exclamation mark and specifying error. And that way this will return a Boolean, true or false, if it exists. And if it does exist, then our form is going to be, or our form field is going to be highlighted as in an error state. but we won't see the effects of this until we actually implement validation. So what we want to add next is an input. And let's just reformat. And inside our input field here, what we want to do is pass in all of the properties that are inside this input property. And what we can do is spread those across inside here. So I'm just going to spread all of the properties that are available inside input. And this is being passed across from our React final form field, and what this provides us with is an onChange handler and an onBlur handler, and also the value of the input as well. And this is all passed into our input field. And we also need the placeholder here as well, and we'll set that to placeholder. And the type in this case goes on our form field itself, so we'll pass in the type and say type. So what we also want to do is provide the validation errors as well. If there is an error on our input, then we want to provide a label that tells the user what the problem is. So what we'll do is, first of all, we'll check that the input's been touched and we have an error. And then what we'll do inside here is we'll pass in a label. So we'll bring in label from Semantic UI React. And we'll make it a basic label, and we'll give it a color of red. And inside here we'll pass in the error. And we've also got an unused property here for the width, and we'll also specify that on our form field as well, just in case we want a different width for our particular field. So this is our text inputs, and we can use this anywhere now inside React Final Form. So what we can do is go back to our activity form, and instead of using the input component, what we can do is specify the component as text inputs. And if we go and take a look at our form again, what we should find is that nothing's really changed, except we've now got our semantic UI styling inside here. And if I type in test and click submit, well, everything's exactly the same. But when we start to add validation a bit later on, we'll find that when we click into a field and click out, we see all of our validation inside there as well. So that takes care of our text inputs. And what we'll do next is we'll just refactor our form so that we're using this text input for all of our fields.